Somewhere in a testing lab at Microsoft, an update got approved, pushed out, and within hours, millions of people around the world watched their computers do something they never asked for. Files went missing. Search bars stopped working the way they should, and in some cases, the very drive that Windows itself lives on became difficult to access properly. No one was fired. No public reckoning followed. The stock barely blinked. And within days, the company was back in headlines, not for damage control, but for pouring billions more into artificial intelligence. If that sequence of events sounds strange to you, stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why it keeps happening, and more importantly, what it means for the safety of your own machine going forward. Let's set the scene properly, because to understand how something like this keeps repeating, you need to understand the sheer scale of the company we're talking about. Microsoft is currently one of the most valuable companies that has ever existed, with a market valuation that has, at various points, pushed past $3 trillion. To put that number in perspective, it's a figure that rivals the entire yearly economic output of major countries. This is not a scrappy startup cutting corners because it's still finding its footing. This is the most resourced software company on the planet, with quality assurance teams, automated testing pipelines, and telemetry systems that most companies could only dream of. And yet, update after update, something breaks. Sometimes it's small, a visual glitch here, a setting that resets itself there. But sometimes it's genuinely serious, the kind of failure that leaves people locked out of their own files or their own systems on a day when they needed them most. Windows still runs on somewhere around 70% of the world's desktop computers, according to tracking firms like StatCounter, even with Linux and macOS slowly chipping away at that number over the past couple of years. 7% might not sound as dramatic as 9 out of 10. But stop and think about what that actually means in practice. It means the operating system underneath your bank's teller terminals, your local hospital's patient record system, government office computers, school computers, and probably the laptop you're watching this video on is largely the same one from the same company, built on the same aging foundation. When something goes wrong with Windows, it doesn't stay contained to one household. It ripples outward into places most of us never think about until the day it fails. We actually got a real preview of what that kind of ripple effect looks like back in 2017 with an attack called WannaCry. This wasn't a Microsoft update gone wrong. To be fair, it was a ransomware worm that exploited a vulnerability in older, unpatched Windows systems. But the lesson it taught the world is directly connected to everything we're talking about today. WannaCry spread to well over 100 countries within a single day. It hit the United Kingdom's National Health Service so hard that patients were turned away, surgeries were canceled, and ambulances had to be rerouted to other hospitals. It knocked out systems at the Spanish telecom company Telefonica. It disrupted operations at FedEx. Germany's national railway, Deutsche Bahn, had its public departure boards infected. Factories in parts of Asia had to pause production lines entirely. All of this happened because a critical security patch existed, but a huge number of organizations either hadn't installed it or were running systems too old to receive it at all. Here's the uncomfortable part of that story that doesn't get talked about enough. Many of those organizations were behind on updates specifically because updates had burned them before. IT departments had learned through painful experience that installing a Windows patch could just as easily break something critical as fix something vulnerable. So they delayed. They tested cautiously. They sometimes skipped patches altogether to avoid disruption. And that hesitation, that reasonable, understandable hesitation, is exactly what left the door open for an attack that could have been prevented. It's a vicious cycle. Updates break things, so people stop trusting updates. So people stop installing updates, so security holes stay open, so attackers walk right through them. Fast forward to more recent years, and that same pattern of trust erosion has continued to build, update by update. There have been patches that interfered with basic access to the primary drive Windows runs on, the digital equivalent of a home renovation crew accidentally welding your own front door shut. There have been updates that broke something as simple and ancient as the built-in calculator app, a tool that has existed on Windows since 1990 and does about as little as a piece of software can possibly do. There have been updates that caused Outlook, the email client used by hundreds of millions of professionals, and businesses around the world, to freeze or crash. None of these are hypothetical concerns. Each one has been documented, reported on by tech outlets, and acknowledged, eventually by Microsoft itself, usually through a support page and a quiet rollback. So by the time a new problematic update rolls out, most experienced Windows users aren't shocked anymore. They're just tired. And tired users are dangerous users, because fatigue breeds complacency, and complacency is exactly what cybercriminals count on. Now let's talk about where all of Microsoft's energy and investment is actually going, while these foundational issues keep resurfacing, because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting from a business perspective. Microsoft has invested roughly $13 billion into OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, a figure that has been widely reported across financial and tech news outlets. That investment helped fuel the rollout of Copilot, Microsoft's AI assistant, which is now woven into Windows itself, into Word, into Excel, into Teams, into the Edge browser, and into an increasing number of corners of the operating system that used to be simple, single-purpose tools. Meanwhile, Microsoft's cloud computing division, Azure, has continued to post strong growth quarter after quarter. And that cloud and AI narrative is a huge part of what keeps investors excited and the stock price climbing. Here's the part worth sitting with for a second. When a Windows update ships with problems, the financial fallout for Microsoft is usually minimal. The stock might dip a fraction of a percent, if that. Compare that to the intense, single-minded focus on AI features, cloud revenue, and Copilot integration, the things that genuinely move the needle for shareholders and headline writers. It doesn't take a genius to figure out where the most talented engineers, the most exciting internal projects, and the biggest promotions are likely concentrated. Foundational operating system reliability is essential, but it isn't glamorous. Nobody gets a standing ovation at a product keynote for making sure your computer boots up correctly every single morning. AI demos get the applause. Stability work gets the maintenance budget. This tension shows up in smaller, almost funny ways too, if it weren't slightly concerning. Take Windows Search, something that should be about as simple as software gets. You press the Windows key, you type the name of a file or a program, and it should show up. That's the entire job description. Instead, over the past few years, that same search box started surfacing trending news headlines, suggested web searches, game recommendations, and yes, even recipe suggestions, none of which have anything to do with finding a file on your own hard drive. It became less of a search tool and more of a content feed wearing a search bar's clothing. Users complained about it constantly across forums and social media, to the point where entire guides exist just to explain how to strip these features back out and restore basic local file search functionality. To be fair, Microsoft has acknowledged this frustration and has talked publicly about simplifying Windows search, prioritizing your actual files and installed apps over web content and clutter. That's a genuinely good move, and it's worth giving credit where it's due. But notice what tends to survive every round of simplification. The AI features, the Copilot suggestions, the parts tied most directly to the company's broader strategic push. It's a pattern worth watching because it tells you a lot about priorities. The features users never asked for tend to be the ones that stick around the longest, simply because they align with where the company wants to go next, not necessarily where its everyday users actually need it to be. There's also a regulatory angle here that doesn't get nearly enough attention in casual tech conversations, and it's genuinely important context. Microsoft has a long, well-documented history with antitrust regulators, particularly in the European Union. Back in the mid-2000s, the EU fined Microsoft close to 500 million euros over how Windows was bundled with software like Internet Explorer and Windows Media Player, arguing that the company was using its operating system dominance to unfairly push out competitors in other markets. That case set an important precedent, and Microsoft has remained under regulatory watch in various forms ever since. Now, with AI tools like Copilot built directly into the operating system layer itself, rather than offered as a separate optional download, regulators in Europe and elsewhere are paying close attention again. When one company's software sits underneath the majority of the world's computers and simultaneously controls how AI gets delivered to those same machines, that's not just a product decision. That's a question of market power, and it's one lawmakers are actively wrestling with right now. None of this means Microsoft is doing anything illegal. It's operating inside a legal and regulatory framework that, frankly, was never designed with this level of scale and interdependency in mind. There was no rulebook written for a scenario where a single company's software update, a routine, boring, everyday update, could ripple out and disrupt hospitals, government agencies, financial institutions, and transportation systems all at once, simply because they all happen to depend on the same underlying platform. When failures like that happen, the consequences for the company tend to be a quiet support article and a pulled update. The consequences for everyone else can be a lost workday, a missed appointment, or, in more serious cases, real operational disruption for organizations that people depend on. So where does that leave you, the person actually sitting in front of a Windows machine, staring at that little update notification, wondering whether clicking Install Now is going to go smoothly or ruin your afternoon? Let's talk practically, because this isn't meant to just be a rant about corporate priorities. It's meant to actually help you navigate this reality more safely. First, understand that skipping updates entirely is not the answer, even though the temptation is completely understandable after everything we've just discussed. Security patches exist because vulnerabilities are discovered constantly, and attackers move fast once a flaw becomes public knowledge. The WannaCry outbreak we talked about earlier is proof of exactly what happens when patching gets delayed at scale. The smarter approach is to update, but update wisely. If you're managing your own personal machine and it isn't mission critical, consider waiting a few days after a major update release before installing it, rather than rushing to click Update Now the moment it appears. In that short window, tech news outlets and enthusiast communities typically surface any major issues quickly, which gives you a chance to see whether a specific update is causing widespread problems before it lands on your machine. Second, always keep a current backup of your important files completely separate from your main drive, ideally using either an external drive or a cloud backup service. This single habit protects you regardless of whether the threat is a bad update, a ransomware attack, a hardware failure, or simple human error. If something does go wrong during an update, having a recent backup turns a potential disaster into a minor inconvenience. Third, if you're running a business or managing multiple machines, look into deferring feature updates through Windows' built-in update management settings, which allow you to delay non-critical updates for a period of time while still receiving essential security patches promptly. This gives you a practical middle ground between blind trust and reckless neglect. Fourth, pay attention to what you're actually installing and enabling on your system, especially when it comes to AI features that are increasingly bundled by default. Features like Copilot can be genuinely useful for some workflows, but they also expand what's running in the background on your machine and, depending on your settings, what data gets processed or shared. Take a few minutes to look through your privacy and AI settings in Windows, understand what's turned on by default, and disable anything you're not actually using. This isn't about being paranoid. It's simply good digital hygiene in an era where more and more software wants access to more and more of your activity by default. Fifth, and this applies broadly beyond just Windows, stay skeptical of urgency. If an update, a pop-up, or any prompt is pressuring you to act immediately without giving you time to think, that's worth a second look, regardless of whether it's coming from your operating system or from a phishing email pretending to be your operating system. Attackers have gotten very good at mimicking legitimate system messages, and the line between this is a real Windows prompt and this is a scam has gotten blurrier over the years. When in doubt, go directly to your system's official settings menu to check for updates rather than clicking on a pop-up you weren't expecting. Stepping back from the practical tips for a moment, there's a bigger point worth making here, and it's really the heart of why this topic matters beyond just individual convenience. When a company becomes as deeply embedded in global infrastructure as Microsoft has, the usual incentives that keep companies careful start to weaken. In a smaller, more competitive market, a company that repeatedly shipped broken, unreliable software would bleed customers to a rival almost immediately. But switching away from Windows for a hospital system, a government agency, a global bank, or even just an average household is genuinely difficult. Software compatibility, staff training, existing infrastructure, all of it creates enormous friction that keeps people locked in, even when trust in the platform has been shaken. That's not necessarily malicious on Microsoft's part, but it does mean the natural pressure that normally forces companies to prioritize reliability is weaker than it should be. And when that pressure weakens, mistakes become easier to make and easier to absorb, because the fallout rarely threatens the bottom line. That's really the core lesson to take away from all of this. The issue isn't that updates exist or that AI is being integrated into modern software. Both of those things are necessary and, in many ways, genuinely useful when done carefully. The issue is what happens when a company grows so large and so deeply, woven into daily life, that the normal consequences of failure stop applying in the same way they would for a smaller competitor. As users, we can't single-handedly fix that dynamic, but we can absolutely protect ourselves within it by backing up our data, by being thoughtful about when and how we update, by understanding what's actually running on our machines, and by staying alert rather than clicking through prompts on autopilot. Technology is only going to keep getting more complex, and the companies building it are only going to keep growing more powerful. The best defense any of us have isn't waiting for a giant corporation to slow down and get everything perfect. It's building smarter habits on our own end so that when something does go wrong, and eventually something always does, you're the one still in control of the outcome. If you found this breakdown useful, stick around, because in the next video we're going deep into how ransomware actually spreads across a network once it gets a foothold, and exactly what warning signs to watch for before it's too late to stop it.